Welcome everyone to round one of the NZIER, New Zealand Schools Debate Nationals. The speaking time is 8 minutes, and POIs can be asked between 1 and 7 minutes. I'm going to bang the table at 1 minute, 7 minutes, and 8 minutes. Please conclude your speech by 8 minutes. We're going to start the round with an introduction of the judges and speakers, with your names and pronouns if you wish. For example, my name is Millie Cully. I'm your chair in this debate, and my pronouns are she, her.
I'm Tamara, I'm a judge. I prefer she or they.
Oh, yes, I'm Robert. I'm first speaker of Waikato, and he, him.
I'm Andrew, second speaker of Waikato, he, him.
Travis Palmer, third speaker of Waikato, he, him.
I'm here, first speaker of CNI, she, her.
Bridget, second speaker of CNI, she, her.
John, third speaker of CNI.
Sweet. If everyone's ready, I invite up the first speaker for the affirmative team to open the debate.
A student at school in Gore has a pretty different experience to someone going to Auckland Grammar. This is because while Grammar is able to put their resources behind making sure that they get the best practice tests, the best books that are going to ensure their students are getting the excellences, the merits, the same is not true of the student who goes to a school in Gore because they don't have the resources to put behind these sorts of educational materials. And while these two students might get the exact same results on paper, when it comes to something like a university application, the admissions officer sees two very different transcripts when deciding who to let in. In this debate, we look to equalise our education system, and we support the Ministry of Education specifying exactly how all subjects are going to be used, how they're going to be run. This looks like setting specific texts in English, setting specific geological contexts and things like geography. This is run by NZQA. And in addition to this, we also support robust and inclusive curriculums for all subjects, not just the popular ones. This does two things. Firstly, we think that the standardization that we get ensures far better educational outcomes for the students. And secondly, we think that we get a far more inclusive educational system as a result. Firstly, then, on standardized education, how this improves outcomes. Because currently, the education that we currently have varies wildly from city to city, town to town, school to school, depending on what sort of funding that school has, depending on the geographical location, depending on what subjects you personally are taking. And a national curriculum, on the other hand, ensures that the material that's taught is standard across all schools, but there isn't that massive range, and we think this improves outcomes for three reasons. Firstly, we think it's far easier for schools to follow one curriculum. Two ways this works. NZQA wording currently is really vague, right? It's not something that you teach in a classroom. It's a set of guidelines about what sort of ideas you're pushing across. And this means that different teachers are interpreted really differently, even within a school. One teacher might, in a media studies class, might be doing German art films from the 50s, whereas another teacher is teaching Parasite, a modern film with direct relevance, things like class inequality, things that are far more relevant to actually teaching the student about what it is to live life in the modern world. Secondly, we think that we get far more resourcing for teachers and students and collaboration between schools on similar topic material. Because when you're all teaching the same thing, it's far more easier to go to conferences, share educational resources, and develop curriculums that are actually suited to the students, that we think we get far better outcomes when teachers are able to take excellence essays, share them with their students, when they're able to craft material, build on what the work of others have done, rather than trying to build an entirely new curriculum. This is also really beneficial for students who are able to go online and get these resources, who are able to actually engage, especially if they're struggling in their subject, engage with students who are going through exactly the same process elsewhere in the country. Secondly, on why standardization is beneficial, because we think it ensures a high level of education across all regions and schools. As I flagged in my introduction, different schools like Auckland Grammar have the ability to select texts that they think have the potential and to build curriculums that they think have the potential to get high marks for their students. And this means that, but when this isn't so true of small rural schools, and this is really important because these smaller rural schools are the ones with the less advantaged students. We think that poorer students are coming to these schools. It's really important that we're able to benefit them, give them an equal shot at life. It's turning achievement standards into actual content to teach is really hard, right? It takes a lot of effort from the teachers, and we think that effort isn't feasible in smaller schools, in schools that aren't as well funded. We think a national curriculum solves this by giving the curriculum that you actually teach to the teachers. Thirdly, we think that it ensures that all students, no matter what subjects they're taking, have the same knowledge base leaving school. Because a subject is now a known quality. It's now a known factor when they're applying for a university, when they're applying for a job. So what are the outcomes of this? 4 things. Firstly, we think that the tertiary institutions, jobs, and polytechnics are far more willing to hire or receive applicants for these people, no matter where they come from. An E is now an E because no matter what material your teacher was teaching, because they're all teaching the same thing. This removes the biases that currently exist in preferential treatment from people from richer areas, because we think that they have the resources to get better grades. Secondly, we think that this matches far more closely with the tough stuff that's actually taught at university, because when it's a nationalised curriculum, people down in Wellington, people from the ministry, are actually able to communicate with universities, with polytechnic institutions, with hiring firms that actually figure out what we need to know as students in a world that's rapidly changing, in a world that requires very different things than what it did 20 years ago when your teacher who was teaching you English got their degree. We think that's really beneficial because it means that the education system is able to change with the times. Thirdly, we think it means all students have the same level of opportunity. There's far less disparity between schools. That one's fairly apparent. I flagged it up earlier in my speech. And fourthly, we think that smaller courses are now far more supported, because a single teacher, right, trying to build an entire history curriculum, trying to build an entire Māori literature curriculum, it's really, really difficult to do. It's so difficult that schools just choose not to run these courses in their world. What we are able to do is give teachers the resources to start these courses up. It's really beneficial for teaching these smaller courses, really beneficial for niche subjects. Secondly then, on how we get a far more inclusive education system. Because schools currently aren't making very inclusive curriculums when they don't have to. They're making stuff that caters either to the staff that are teaching there, or to things that line up with the views of the majority, often ethnic majorities, based on the geographical locations, things that they're comfortable with. This is especially problematic in smaller rural schools, especially problematic with small courses within these schools. How do we fix this? 2 ways. Firstly, schools now teach content that demonstrates inclusive thinking, inclusive patterns of behaviour. In history, you're now teaching about things like Stonewall and the LGBTQ movement. You're also teaching about things like the land wars. This helps fix the collective groan that happens when the Year 9 social studies teacher says, now we're going to do stuff on the treaty, right? Because the problem with these material currently is not that they're not boring. It's not that they shouldn't be taught. It's that the current resources that we have to teach them aren't adequate and aren't engaging with students. And it's really important that we're able to get students engaged in this, because this is how our country runs, right? The treaty is a really important document that students are actually able to understand, not just shrug off as something that they sort of were forced to learn about in Year 9 social studies. Secondly, we think it's far better and far easier to get pushback against curriculums that are not diverse. Because currently communities don't have a real way to get a school to change what they're teaching, other than just maybe writing them a letter. We think schools aren't very responsive to this sort of pressure from small groups in the community. But when you're able to get global or national outrage about what's being taught in the national curriculum, when you're able to lobby politicians down in Wellington to say that they're actually going to be standing for something being included in the national curriculum, we are able to address biases and get people to influence the curriculum to be more inclusive. Why is it really important that we have diverse education systems? Two reasons. Firstly, we think it improves Māori and Pacifica outcomes because now the material that's being taught in these mainstream classes better reflects their influence. If they're a minority in the school that they attend, these courses previously were teaching it through quite a white lens. The ministry is now mandating that they're teaching it through a more diverse lens. Secondly, non-minority groups are able to far better recognise the struggle of the others. We think this builds a better, more inclusive society and helps ensure that we get better educational outcomes for everyone. Proud to confirm.
Let's let the speaker for their speech. And I invite up the first speaker from the negating team to open the team's case.
When we change the curriculum to a hegemonic structure, we risk all the diversity and engagement that made students engage in the classroom in the first place, that made teachers feel comfortable going into a classroom with students that they know were going to be excited about what was going to be taught. And we give you the knowledge that could never, ever be ignored on our side of the house, because we can never stand for a world in which we exchange the colour and diversity of education for the monochromatic decision of the government. We stand for the status quo. With that in mind, we're bringing three arguments to the debate today. Firstly, why student passion for learning and engagement improves on our side of the house. Secondly, how we rest the diversity of education under their side of the house, and then a split at Bridget on how we burden schools and teachers with curriculum change. Firstly, I'd just like to make three main points of rebuttal. Most of this will be integrated in my speech. So we first of all came up with the idea that we're bringing schools to an equal playing field, but we just had this massive assumption that every school that now by being held to the same standard just automatically would have the same resources and motivation for these types of learning. We tell you that top schools such as grammar, we're going to always have this massive disparity, that we're always going to have more time and resources to invest in this massive curriculum change. With these people from Gore that they were really concerned about, they were never going to have the same time, the same students engaging on the same way that you had really ambitious students going for, and teachers from low decile schools who are incredibly time for, even if they have same resources. Like there's a massive debt that they actually conceded on their side of the house. It's massive obligation to already burden teachers in an already burdened system who now have to change the entire curriculum. We tell you that's just completely ridiculous to claim as a benefit. But secondly, on opportunity and disparity, we tell you that we leave students behind who can't catch up to average levels of curriculum. We tell you that they need support in a way that you just can't get from other schools. When we have a blanket approach to education, we risk the diverse needs of so many vulnerable students. And thirdly, on engagement, we think it's really important that we tell you that for every student, there is going to be a collective groan when you hear the word Shakespeare. We think it's unfair when we limit their democracy and threaten their attention, when we tell students that you're actively going to have to pursue a narrow line of education and that they have no say. We lose engagement. I'll talk more on that in my substantive point. So within this, why student passion for learning and engagement improves on our side of the house? Because we tell you under the status quo, schools are largely following the New Zealand curriculum, but they cater the text, the history and their courses specific to their school. We think there are numerous characteristics of students that need to take place in engaging the school system. This looks like affluent children who are largely more ambitious. This looks like middle class children from a public school who are largely knowledgeable but a bit risky. And thirdly, like low decile school children who struggle to see the point in going to school because all of their friends have dropped out and none of their parents have gone to university. When we lump all of these people into the same educational requirement, all of these children into the same curriculum, that's so incredibly abusive to the support and engagement for the children who need the education the most. Yeah.
Currently, students who want to pursue things like trades within school are faced with subjects that don't cater to their needs, that are underfunded and under-resourced. Is it not better to have standardised curriculums for these such subjects?
We just think like, okay, if we'll just take that there are students who want to get engaged with trades, we tell you it's far more better when they can sort of mould their own education. We tell you that it's very flexible to go up to teachers and talk about doing diverse topics. You just get no democracy or no say whatsoever when you have voices from high above saying that you have to follow a strict, narrow curriculum. You never get any diversity or any choice on your side of the house. So why is it that we get more diverse requirements and engagement? This is really important. 4 reasons. First of all, we think under their side of of the House, we either get really high-level text in an attempt to uplift students. That's really dangerous to students on the lower ends of education who are just not going to digest with Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. We tell you that it's really, really dangerous to people who are just completely disengaged because they can't learn anything from it. Secondly, you get a medium-level text that's just largely acceptable. We tell you that we actually get high achievers that are going to get really bored and disengaged with the school system. That's also really, really dangerous because they're probably going to go on into really catered, very demanding requirements that are going to be really great for the future of New Zealand. But thirdly, even if you get an easy text that's great for have a safety net for schools, we tell you we drag the whole level of education down, and we also risk students getting probably moderately okay with the school system, now bored, now less engaged. We lose the majority here. That's really important. But fourthly, as we told you, we remove the rights of children to choose what they study, because the differences in education were so important to children who have different levels of academic ambition and capability. We need to support the people on the lower end and push those on a higher end. Here's why it's better on our side of the house. Two reasons. Firstly, we diagnose student retention and engagement rates to a much higher level. Because students have diverse interests, as SciDAP has told you, when you have a class of predominantly people of colour or from the middle class, we tell you texts like Grapes of Wrath are not going to appeal to you. They're not going to be engaging. You don't see any relevance to them. When you introduce them texts in history directly applicable to you, this looks like Moonlight for predominantly coloured classes. This looks like the Waikato War for those in Hamilton. We tell you that's actually really exciting and engaging. That makes you feel directly recognised by a system that you feel oppressed by under side affirmative, and then you have an effort and engagement to learn. What are the impacts of this? Firstly, when we cater education directly to student needs, we tell you that education becomes way more dynamic and needs to be recognised in the context within the ability of the students at school and its geographical and historical precedent. We get way more buy-in from students at both ends of education and within the middle, because we tell you that they're always going to want to come to school to learn about things that are engaging to them. This doesn't look like shoving Shakespeare down the throat of schools that struggle to improve literacy rates and readings above the age of 15, or students that recognise what they learn is directly helpful to their community, e.g. local Māori land battles, e.g. niche community origins, that's completely lost under side affirmative. We tell you that it's so important that we retain community engagement at a granular and at a meta level. We lose this when we wash it with less sophisticated national curriculum. What are the impacts of this? Thirdly, we get more engaged students, as we told you. Secondly, we get students that are being victimised and accelerated, having massive benefits on our side of the house when we cater this for them. And thirdly, we don't risk community engagement and specific cultural knowledge. So let's look at my second substantive, how we risk the diversity of education. Because we already told you when we dictate the school curriculum, we shut out the millions of opportunities of education and ownership. I'm going to look at two strands. Firstly, how we don't actually get diverse educative narratives. And secondly, even if we do, why we always shut out other voices. Here's why it's not going to be diverse. Firstly, New Zealand just has an incredibly turbulent history, most of which just hasn't been adequately compensated or recognised. It's at the point where John Key tells you that New Zealand was settled peacefully, or there are massive massacres in rural provinces during the New Zealand War that just haven't been apologised or recognised for. There's a significant systemic issue within New Zealand, which we don't think will ever happen for the government to just suddenly admit to these massacres, their failure within history. And we tell you that in the note of example of Māori education within school, there's a completely other debate to be had about that, but we're far more, we're always going to have benefits on our side of the house to have at least some degree of Māori education, some degree of really colourful and diverse curriculum standards, then none at all. We're happy to stand for better funding, etc. We tell you that even if we do get diverse narratives on the second strand, we're always going to leave voices out, because we tell you it's actually really dangerous when we have so many students now that know a lot about one particular topic and nothing about any of the other things. Great that they know about Māori rights, but they know nothing about the Rainbow Movement, transatlantic history. That's really dangerous to the diversity of society and uplifting it as a whole. Proud to oppose.
I'd like that speaker for a speech, and I'll invite up the second speaker of the affirmative team to continue the team's case.
You have to tilt the camera to cater for short people.
Sorry.
Right now, schools see an inequality whose effects are wildly understated by the other team. If a history class at Auckland Grammar shares little to no similarities with the history class at Hamilton Girls High or Otahunga College, except for the exams they take at the end of the year, their approach to those future things will be just as different at the end of the year and in their future. And that doesn't necessarily mean better grades. This can mean much worse outcomes for students that can impact them in far more areas of their life than NEG wants to accept. In this speech, I'm going to begin with some rebuttals surrounding a few main areas of clash and then go into a split point about how this improves student well-being. But firstly, we're going to go through some rebuttal. Most of this debate so far has centered around the impact on teaching and student results. And we were very clear on our side of the house that that our policies was one that furthered equality, inclusivity, and student success through teaching. This improves student results and improves their futures. Next, contentions here surrounded two main points of clash. Firstly, diversity. Secondly, engagement. Firstly, I want to talk to you about diversity. And the main contention we had from NEG here just surrounded the fact that like schools want to teach things that match like say diverse cultural or like ethical backgrounds to match their student body. We have four responses to this. Firstly, we tell you that like, yes, it's true that we want to teach things that are like culturally sound and accepted in the modern day. And we tell you that it's not true that the government in this day and age isn't willing to accept and move towards these things. In fact, we tell you that at the age today where we have a female prime minister, where we have a wide range of ethnic backgrounds represented in parliament, we tell you that like the government is especially able to and uniquely able to create educational systems that are created by experts with a diverse range of backgrounds, with a diverse range of experiences. That's not something you get in the independent education created on their side of the house or like national adapted standards that they get on their side of the house. Only a board of experts creating things can do this. Secondly, on the comparative, students who learn under like a differing curriculum can be distanced in their future from people with other views, right? Because if you've learned something wildly different from your friends at another school, when you apply to a job or apply to university, you'll be suffering from that same differences and lack of learning that you got compared to your friends in other schools. This is hugely damaging towards students' futures. It's something we highlight in our first speech. It's not something that negating was able to talk about enough. It's something they crucially must engage with to win this debate. Thirdly, we tell you that the government setting of like broad curricula can also actually like improve access to resources surrounding these things, right? Because like information surrounding like Māori settlements or like certain injustices in the past are lacking like in the past and today, and making those parts like part of our curriculum mandated by the government, by education boards, improves public perception of these things. It improves teachers' access to resources, ensuring that more teachers are able to access like information pertaining to these areas, and it ensures that students in the future will be more accepting broadly, not just of views that reflect their own environments and their own culture, but of views that affect the culture and environments of all of New Zealand and the governing board that decides these. Fourthly and lastly, we tell you that it's much easier to regulate these decisions at the point where it's a government decided by the government, because as the public, they are able to like regulate and authoritize and like hold the government to account for these decisions. Before I move on, I'll take a POI if you have one.
So on this point of easier like standard curriculum, what do you think is more important? Having students that get maybe more excellences, or having more students who actually want to go to school because they're interested in the things that are directly applicable to them in the curriculum?
Right, I know we hate saying this in debates, but I will get to this later in my speech, like right now. So our second point surrounded engagement. Note that this directly responds to the POI from 5 seconds ago. You told us that students will be naturally less engaged in some subjects, and this will make students less interested. Okay, we have 4 responses to this again. First, we told that it's not true that the government mandates of like education programs will be monochrome or black and white. They're not going to make everyone like learn Shakespeare for a whole year, right? We see that this looks more like broad education programs designed by like a board of educational experts who know that it's important to like vary the things that students learn. This might mean you learn about Shakespeare in one term, 1984 in another term, and like some creative fiction or non-fiction in later terms. We can see that this creates a much broader sense of education. Again, they don't get that on their side of the house. Secondly, though, and crucially, even if schools do tailor to the specific needs, like on your side, they're still not tailoring to everyone, right? Classes of students have 20, 30 plus people, and we'd rather be somewhat good for like all of these students rather than tailoring to extremes. No matter what you're teaching them, you're not going to have all 30 students in your class engaged, right? Not all 30 people, regardless of where you are, what your background is, are going to be interested in the same things. We'd rather ensure that everyone is somewhat engaged, everyone has some element element of the course that they're interested in than none at all. That's very important. That's not something they get on their side of the house. Thirdly, though, we tell you that you're still forcing a system either way, right? Like, it's still like the education systems are still something you have to go through. That's not really something that students can avoid, and that's not really something we see to be a problem. Fourthly, and lastly on this, we tell you that the government is like big, right? Like, they can uniquely implement systems in which they are able to actually like foster the programs to develop like widespread education programs. That's crucially important towards this point. Secondly, the second thing they told us on engagement was about students of varying capability, telling us that students with varying like academic skill levels may be dragged down or be bored. Two responses to this. Firstly, it's just not true that like students are now immediately going to be dragged down, right? Like, or up, right? Like, scaling can still happen in classes. Like, people can be moved into higher levels of NCA. People can be moved into like different kind of spectrums of the NCA or like educational syllabus. That's not something that we anticipate removing. Secondly, though, we tell you that like learning World War II versus like the land wars doesn't really change the difficulty of your courses, right? Like, the content matter we cover in your courses is subject to like your year level and how much education you've undergone, and it doesn't really matter which part of that course, like which element of that specific subject you're learning. The difficulty is pretty much the same either way. That's still something we see in the status quo on their side of the house, because everyone has to sit the same exams at the end of the year. It's not like you're magically set to lower standards just because you're learning a different text. I'll take a POI there, POI.
Oh, okay. So considering there are a lot of schools like with very tailored needs, e.g. Māori kupapa schools, why is it like better that they learn about like World War II like the rest of the country, or on our side of the house, like the local Māori land conflicts within their region?
Look, like, just the fact that you asked that PY clearly shows you haven't been listening to the rest of my speech, right? Like, it's clearly probably a pre-written one that you've got on your piece of paper there. I have told you over and over in the past that the government is able to like create a broad range of educational programs that includes multiple areas, including World War II, including the land wars. They ensure that that people are able to learn a diverse range of subjects under their subject and are not locked into a single way of learning like you may in other areas. All right, very quickly, I'm going to talk about my POI, about my split point, about how this improves student well-being. The problem today is that students are often quite uncertain of their progress, grades, or what to expect. This increases the stress many students feel and negatively hurts their mental health. For example, students who learn different English texts are more uncertain of what to expect when they get into their exam, right? Standardized exact content helps in several ways. Firstly, we tell you that students actually know what to anticipate going into exams, because students are far more certain of what they need to learn, what they're learning, and where they're at, because it's far easier to track your progress when everyone around you is doing the same thing. This reduces student uncertainty crucially, and it makes sure students are more confident in the way that they're learning. Secondly, we tell you that this allows for easier resource access. My first one touched on this briefly, and we tell you that while exemplars and study resources are limited currently, finding relevant ones for your topic can place undue stress on students, and standardized teaching ensures that everyone has access to a wide range of resources, a wide range of study materials. They don't get that on their side of the house. At the end of this debate, we see a world in which we get broader learning, better learning, and healthier learning. I'm very proud to affirm.
Let's thank the speaker for their speech, and I'll invite up the second speaker of the negating team to continue today's debate.
Side F's best, we see a large-scale struggle for schools to catch up. So I will be furthering this point about how we burden schools after I rebut the affirmative team's case. So we kind of see this falling under two areas of clash. So I've identified this first as the educational outcomes, and secondly, the access within the school. So first, they kind of came out and said, like, with the ministry mandating educational and like education, it would be more diverse. So we should see, like, why would one, the Ministry of Education, and like which falls under the government, teach about the fundamental issues that the government has in the past pushed against these minorities that you claim they will teach about, and two, the ministry has limited knowledge of the trades you push to help when they have like limited knowledge of this, right? They're not going to know anything about the agriculture. They're not going to know about these all really limited groups. So how are they going to create a beneficial curriculum for them? And so you also talked about how like they would it would be like a more inclusive education. But when we see, for example, kids in history class under the status quo, where they're currently learning about like things, they are choosing what they want to learn about, right? You can like, you could choose a suffragette movement while your classmate is doing land wars. But when you see that they are writing about something that they are not interested in, then they are not going to put any like little effort into doing this. And when you say kids will groan when they hear about the topic that they're given, we just see that under the status quo, history is given the option for you to choose. Therefore, students are choosing what they are interested in, not being forced by something that NZQA thinks they should be interested in. And we think this is really beneficial. And so they, under kind of school access, they talked about how it was easier for schools, but this is just inherently not true for those you gave an example in Gore. For the large majority, they do not have easy access to like implementing this curriculum, not only by accessing these books that these rich schools can access, but also by like re-changing their entire way they teach. This is just so hard, and I'll be touching on this further in my substantive. And you talked about how under this they could go online and compare teachings, but like these layouts of like essays already exist, and we kind of see that under the status quo, things like science and things like maths are already taught for the exams that students do at the end of the year. There isn't actually that kind of broad thing, so a teacher can't go off and talk about something in maths that just isn't relevant. Like if a teacher does that, they are not doing their job. So we just think that this kind of applies to those subjects like history or English, where there is an area of like discussion that can happen within the class. And so, like, again, on the limited resources, we see schools being forced to buy these resources that they currently do not have when they could be teaching about, it's a fine enough, area, but they, and so these higher up schools still, even when you said under your side that these higher schools would equalize the education system, we just think this is inherently not true, because these higher up schools still have more money to buy these resources. These resources are pushed by the government, and they're not given the opportunity to have equal resources. And so again, on the small curriculums, having these better inputs, we just think the ministry, as I talked about, just does not have time to look into every niche subject. And in the Ministry of Education, they don't have people specifically for agriculture, people specifically for these trade groups. And so they are actually going to not benefit the subject, right? Because they're going to create a curriculum that might not actually be relevant at all. And so we see if teachers are kind of creating this curriculum, especially in these groups where you don't have an exam, we see an actual better widespread education. I'll take a POI.
Who do you think knows more about creating a diverse curriculum? A white 60-year-old history teacher, or a ministry made up of hundreds and hundreds of specialists, especially trained in diversity in education?
Well, one, we think that this ministry, as I said, just does not have time to kind of look into these things, right? A lot of people in this ministry haven't actually been teachers, right? In the government, if you're in the Ministry of Education, you don't actually have to have been a teacher. So you don't know what's beneficial within the school. Two, these 6-year-old history teachers have been there a while. They have seen what has benefited their students and what will be beneficial for them in schools. And I mean in exams, sorry. And so they again, they kind of talk about how they improved the quality, but we just think this is just does not exist under their side of the house. And so they also talked about how kind of under school access, they can be moved up in NCA. We just think that this is still quite a rigid system. You can't have a student sitting in an English class being bored out of their mind when they could be going to another class and kind of learning the topics, right, but not having to do the exams and just having a broader knowledge of this. But this just would not happen because they have to stay and have to be strict on what they are learning. And so I'll kind of be moving on to my split on how we burden these schools under the MOOC. So those affected in these schools are teachers, but we see this issue as largely teachers. So kind of falling under two main reasons as to why this is true. We see the first as being the financial effect, and second, the lack of time for teachers. So kind of under the financial effect on schools, we see with the new and exact curriculum, resources like textbooks and worksheets, etc., are having to be provided to these students. So this is an issue, and we see these impacts as specific schools not being able to have, to immediately forward for an immediate change in the curriculum, right? If they push forward in a curriculum change, it can't be a gradual thing. It has to be a movement that happens right then, because it's going to affect the exams that the students take at the end of the year. And secondly, we see students being charged for these resources in turn. So this kind of looks like students whose families who really could be struggling having to pay for these books. Under status quo, we have an easier wide range of resources, as schools already have this in their schools, right? They have these there that they have resources they can teach on, and it doesn't mean that everyone suddenly, if you don't have history books on some really subject that the government has chosen for in history, you can choose your own topic. So that means that you get to find your resources. It actually means it gives better motives for students, because it means they can push for their resources and kind of gives them the opportunity to learn how to find them themselves. And so with it's either the NZQA deciding on what you should be interested in, or students deciding what you should be interested in. So kind of on the second point on the lack of time for teachers. So we see even at affirmatives best with no financial burden, teachers have to learn an entirely new curriculum if the curriculum doesn't fit what they are currently teaching. So this means that teachers who commonly teach different age groups, different year groups, they have to learn it by the time the next academic year rolls around. So teachers, as we can probably agree on both sides of the house, are largely underpaid and overworked currently. So this places more workload, and it's too much to ask. We see loss of incentive to actually broaden these topics as they teach, but in the long term, a lack of incentive to actually become a teacher because of the less creative output that these teachers are provided with. So when you say you can teach broad, do you consider that learning different things each term is still limited to each year? We just think this is extremely harmful. Very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for her speech, and I'll invite up the third speaker of the affirmative team to conclude his team's debate.
A small rural school in Northland has just over 100 students and employs a small staff of educators and teachers. The current burden placed on this school is absolutely insane. They have to spend immense time and effort developing an entirely separate subject-specific curriculum to that school based off the one or two vague, ambiguous statements that are in the National Curriculum Guidelines. They get no support from the government. They have no access to shared resources and shared teaching ability. The government has to develop a supporting system to provide them specific information and develop the ability for them to engage with their students and engage with their education. There are 2 points of class today. Firstly, what is the impact on education outcomes and student engagement? And secondly, what is the impact on providing diverse learning outcomes and inclusive opportunities for all students? So firstly, let's start with student engagement and education outcomes. The opposing team told us that all the content that's going to be taught will be the same, that homogeneous education is going to be really bad for student engagement. We have a few responses to this. Firstly, 5 responses actually. Firstly, education is still diverse. Especially this comes from the fact that different subjects are going to be offered at schools. Students can still explore their passions and interests for like dance or technology that interests them in them subjects and that they want to engage with at school because they still have the opportunity to take different subjects. Secondly, students are not going to be controlling the curriculum any more in your world than they will be in ours. The curriculum independently taught by schools or in certain students is not going to be engaging students because it's still developed by an authority that is above these class students. It's developed by teachers, an education authority that comes from the same industry as the Ministry of Education. Students are going to be responding no better to Shakespeare being shoved down their throats by their teachers than content and Shakespeare shoved in their throat by the government. We see no difference in student engagement. Thirdly, it was a gross mischaracterization from the opposing team to say that students are only engaging with one specific topic under our model, like just land wars and history. We fully support a curriculum that engages across multiple topics and learning outcomes, that engages with multiple perspectives. A student in history is going to be learning about the escalation of World War I and the founding of the UN and the women's suffrage movement all in 1 year, multiple different topics. And the government is also able to push for more inclusive learning outcomes when they're able to specifically mandate specific learning curriculum topics. This looks like them pushing for the education about Stonewall, about LGBTQ rights. This point has not been responded to, as brought up by my first speaker and down the line by our second speaker. That's a really damaging loss for the opposing team. Fourthly, teachers actually are going to be creating more engaging class activities that will be able to connect with their students in education because of the resources that are being shared between these educators and between these teachers. They are able to develop better classroom programs because, like, if one teacher in one school in part of the country has a report that students responded really well to this specific PowerPoint or to this specific slide set, or this example that I used in class was really engaging for those students. This education and this classroom initiative can then be adopted and shared between other teachers because they're all teaching the same essays and the same topics and the same points of discussion. So when something that really engages a student is found and that can be shared across all of education in New Zealand, and that benefit can be applied to all of these students. Finally, we tell you that we still have multicultural students attending these schools, and we still have lots of students from different backgrounds and lots of students all contributing a different voice and perspective to class discussions. So even if the actual curriculum, like worded content in the national curriculum isn't going to be inclusive, we still create better student engagement because these students from different backgrounds are all contributing their voice in the discussions in class, and they still have all of these multicultural perspectives. Finally, students are not engaging with school for other reasons, such as their life at home or a general disinterest in the education system. They want to go and pursue a trades pathway or a polytechnic later in life. The opposing team is not able to solve this issue under their case. They have no real concrete benefits that they've provided in this debate. Their only case is sort of mitigatory material around our benefits that we're providing. They're still happy with the status quo. They're still happy with allowing students to have a general disengagement with the system currently. And students currently have no option to choose their curriculum. They're not able to influence teachers and schools that independently choose subject-specific content. Students are still in this position. So secondly, let's talk about how teachers are going to be teaching this content. Firstly, when the subject content is taught in the curriculum, it is going to be standard across schools. This means that teachers are able to share teaching resources, PowerPoints, and class activities, and this supports teachers by removing that burden on their time and effort so that they have more free time, they're less stressed, and they're able to better engage with their students. This is a benefit that was brought by our first speaker and has not been properly responded to by the opposing team. Secondly, a history teacher has had years of university level education that has enabled them to learn about all of the different areas of content in their curriculum. If they're unsure about one area of the curriculum that the government has put into it, that they're unsure about one specific topic, they have a university level education. So they still have the capacity and ability to learn about this at a high school level, and they're still able to effectively engage and teach this content. Teachers also have transferable skills, and the incentive to become a teacher is not to spend hours devising a curriculum, it's not to develop subject-specific content, it's to actually have time to reach out to your students, to engage with better support, and to engage with education. Finally, teachers in charge of the subject have to devise this entire content-specific curriculum on their own, and they cannot build off the support and work of other teachers. We limit the burden and stress that are placed upon these teachers. The impact of this that has been unresponded to by the opposing team as of at this point in the debate is that these teachers are now going to begin to cut off small subjects and cut off funding or stop offering small subjects where it's really hard to develop and devise new curriculums. They're going to drop subjects like Māori education or dance because the information and support is not given by the government. So let's move on to the second point of clash around how we get better diverse learning outcomes and how New Zealand's national curriculum is actually going to be really inclusive. Firstly, the New Zealand national curriculum is really diverse currently, and there's lots of broad viewpoints that are being expressed. This looks at us offering te reo exams and translation opportunities in school, driving forward Māori education and Māori language learning. Secondly, the NZQA board is representative of all cultures across New Zealand, and Māori and Pacifica students have a voice in NZQA. They are able to engage with student feedback. Thirdly, and most importantly, it is much easier to scrutinize a central authority for education. Māori and Pacifica students are able to push back against NZQA when there is an overruling authority that they can direct feedback and criticism towards. They can lobby this politically because NZQA and the Ministry of Education is a government program. This means that we are going to get more student engagement because the students feel like they have a voice. They feel like they now have a central authority, a large group that they can direct their feedback towards and that they feel listened to, and they can express their opinion to the government. This is not offered from the opposing team through isolated groups of schools and each industry devising specific curriculum content independently. Finally, it was really disappointing that the opposing team thought that the Ministry of Education doesn't have information about New Zealand. We're talking about officials who have trained in university education, who have spent 4 years, and there's an entire industry of trained staff and analysts and experts. This is completely absurd from the opposing team. Their case does not engage with the real world.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech, and I'll invite up the third speaker from the negating team to conclude today's substantive debate.
The last 2 minutes of material you just heard from Third F basically conceded the fact that the status quo is broad, it is diverse, and it is enabling for materially beneficial educational outcomes for students in New Zealand. That was all the material about how you get Pacifica and Māori students to give feedback onto these boards, onto these like educational curriculum deciders came from. We think that's so important because it actively shows they don't have this benefit on their side of the house. 2 clashes for the house today then. Firstly, who gets the best educational outcomes, including diversity, and then secondly, another point of clash about who gets better accessibility and resources. So firstly, on this point of clash about who gets better educational outcomes, including diversity. What did they tell us? They basically told us at first that like under their side of the house, when they have a curriculum that has been set by a national curriculum, that everyone's going to have amazing resources and all that kind of thing, and they're all going to learn the same things, and that's really, really good because they have the same resources and you get better academic results. Then they told you at second that people are going to learn different things in different schools. This came as a response to me as POI about the Māori kaupapa schools. Firstly, they necessarily have to stand for a world where like all schools in New Zealand have to learn the same education and the same curriculum. That's just the nature of the smooch. We tell you at the point where you have a national curriculum that's catering to all exact content in the subjects, you necessarily have all schools learning this, so they have to have this burden and this harm on their side of the house. But even at the point they do get this like separatist education, we think that's a completely different issue, and we're not willing to engage with this. They then told us that the system is really, really inclusive because you get like inclusive nature of messages within this, and you can have all these people learning all these messages. We tell you that at the point we have everyone learning the same education, that's just going to cater to majoritarianist views. People deciding it aren't going to be this like super diverse, like super catering to like social justice issues parliament that they try to tell you. We think this is a complete mischaracterization. We think the people deciding this are likely to be ministries, and like a lot of them are going to be old, like middle-aged or old white men, and they're probably not going to really cater to like the LGBT rights or the women's rights that they were so keen to stand for. Secondly, on this, teachers are always going to have a better perspective of what is beneficial for their students to learn, what is going to give them the most diverse education, and what's actually going to engage with them. We think that's so critical in this debate, because when you have students actively engaging in the content that they're learning, you actually get better educational outcomes because they're more likely to engage with this, therefore they're going to learn better. We think that's so important. At the end of the day, even if you do have like messages coming through on their side of the house, firstly, they're going to be really, really isolating for like a lot of people. And this just comprehensive, like it's just common knowledge that there's human experiences mean people have very different like political beliefs. If you're learning about like women's rights in history, there's always going to be people that don't like agree with women's rights. That's not going to cater for healthy discussion that we think we better achieve on our side of the house when you have a more diverse and more broad curriculum. Secondly, the government's never really going to give like informative education about social justice, because the fact is these policies that cause these social injustices that they're probably going to learn in subjects like history are like a result of the policies they enacted themselves, or their parties enacted themselves, and they had oppression on people. That's really, really bad, because at the point they don't get all this like super diverse, super good messages, we think this is a unique benefit to our side of the house. They then told you that because everyone gets the same subject knowledge, it's really, really beneficial because it gives the opportunity to all students for a high-level education. Quite frankly, we just don't think this engaged with our point at all. Students from Otahonga High School are never going to have the same level of education as students from Auckland Grammar or students from King's College. We think that at the point you have the same content going to all these students, you're never going to have like students that in Otahonga High School that are going to really get really good results studying things like Lord of the Flies or Shakespeare. You're going to have students in those schools like from low decile and low socioeconomic areas getting better results with content that actually engages them and is actually relatable for them, and they can actually produce good results. What does this look like? It looks like them studying like The Dark Horse in English, or like Once Were Warriors, more confronting, more relatable messages for them. They then told us on this that like under the status quo we don't have a diverse education because NZQA is just not favourable to this. We gave you so many mechanisms at NZIER as to why we do. At the end of the day, you give structural reasons as to why you don't get that. We actively enable that. Then they told us that like this is really, really harmful on our side of the house because we distance people in society because they have really, really diverse knowledge, and then we're not going to be a functional society. We still think under our side of the house, people have the capacity to learn like these compromising views of their own. This looks like healthy discussion on different topics. It looks like schools learning about vaping in science because so many students have a vaping addiction. This is just something you're not going to get under their side of the house because they just won't have this broad, diverse curriculum. They're just going to have a homogenized, streamlined, whitewashed curriculum where no one is going to learn anything apart from the things that are in the curriculum. That's really, really important. They then gave you this split point on well-being. Quite frankly, we just don't think this is that like relevant. At the end of the day, well-being for students is largely determined by their education, not through all the things they tried to bring you. There was this whole issue about niche subjects. They said they really, really catered to niche subjects because there's now a standardized version for them. They're going to get better outcomes for this. We still think there is largely a capacity for niche subjects within our side even if we have like a few students doing it. We think this looks like classical studies, which exists in our own school, that we have students doing this. We think this looks like agriculture. We have a really, really good agriculture program at collegiate. That's a result of a niche subject because there's like not that big of a group doing it, but we think that like at the point you have like 10 students doing an agriculture program, then you have more capacity to do that. And we don't think that's a unique benefit they can claim. But secondly, we think that even at the point they do get these better niche subjects, we think that's like a trade-off we're willing to make in order to avoid the whitewashed, homogenized curriculum I just talked to you about. Secondly, on this point about accessibility and resources, they told us that when they have a national curriculum, it's easier for schools to follow because they have better resourcing online, and NZQA is just so broad and they just can't get the outcomes that are really, really important. Firstly, we don't think this is true. It's so much for schools to spend to like get new books, learn like the new history curriculum, and then be able to comprehensively teach that to the students like straight away. We heard no evidence from the affirming side of the house as to how long this change is going to take. And so we think that like you can't just expect teachers overnight just to completely revolutionize their education. But secondly, at the end of the day, we don't think this is mutually exclusive. We think there's comprehensive mechanisms within education currently that we're happy to support, things like Learn Coach, things like Study Time. We're happy to develop those. At the end of this debate, we are not the side that gets a homogenized, whitewashed curriculum. We actively encourage broad, diverse learning. We're incredibly proud to oppose.
I'd like to speak for their speech. As is customary, I'll reverse the speaking order and invite up the negative leader to conclude today's debate.
We had two options for curriculums today. We had an incredibly static curriculum that risks students' retention and exploits the systemic barrier of underfunded schools. Or we had the status quo that gave democracy and support to students who had needs that could not be captured in the limited scope of NZQA's questionable dream of a captivating school curriculum. 3 points of clash in today's debate. Firstly, who gets the better attention and engagement of students? Secondly, who gets the diverse school curriculum? And then thirdly, on access and resourcing. So let's look at this first point, who gets better attention and engagement from students? So what we heard from Side Affirmative was that we get better standardized curriculum that removes the stress from students and makes it easier to regulate. Firstly, we just tell you that the stress is just a sunk harm. We tell you that when you have people doing the same subject, like no matter if they have a class full of students studying the same thing, they're always going to be stressed that substantive was not strong enough to stand as a benefit on our side of the house. We tell you that's just largely redundant. But secondly, on regulation, that was a point they wanted to push. We tell you that the regulation itself is just predicated on bias, because even if you didn't have a financial burden, you always had teachers in schools that were going to be massively unbalanced in terms of what they could provide to students, in terms of the time that they could provide to students, and in terms of the ambition and requirement of the students themselves. We tell you it was never an even playing field. When we had so many students that had different needs, we gave you numerous characterizations of this in my speech, not really responded to. But then at second, they told us that they weren't going to stand for standardized learning anymore. They were now going to stand for a board curriculum change. At third, they told us that we were going to have students now having like a bunch of knowledge in a bunch of different topics. Know that this is exactly what we stand for on our side of the house under the status quo. We really think diverse texts are important, so we can claim all of these benefits as well. But even at the best, we still risk this community niche knowledge that we think is so important. We told you in a POI why losing local Māori knowledge was really bad, because they can never implement niche knowledge in a national curriculum. We tell you that students in schools have very specific context and regional-based knowledge and history that was really engaging for students to learn on. They could never implement this on a national scale because it just wasn't engaging enough for a student from Auckland to learn about the nuances of the Hawke's Bay regional and industrial development. So secondly, on the diverse student curriculum. So we just want to point out the numerous contradictions we heard from Side F. We thought that we needed a new curriculum because ours wasn't adequate enough. But then Third told us that very passionately that as it stands, the curriculum was very broad, it was very diverse and inclusive, and that Māori students and Pacific students had a great onus to engage with these levels of systems of education. So first of all, we tell you, as I just said, that niche knowledge was never going to be held into this national curriculum. They have to forfeit this right. This isn't something that we can stand for. But also just on the general characterizations of the ministry, we think that the specific oversight of teachers within schools was going to be far better than the distant reality of ministries that can't engage in the calculus of specific students and schools' needs simply because they don't have the time and resources to go through every school in New Zealand, go through sort of every literacy rate, every need for students. That was not going to be possible. We tell you schools are far, far better at diagnosing this. What did we hear from this in response? We told you that more people are going to know more about the same thing. That was a great thing for them. But we just tell you, in order for society to be diverse, get all of these benefits, we tell you we need this broad curriculum. Even if when we take the soft line that they said that we also get a broad curriculum, we tell you our house was always going to be way more important when we had more specific needs that were going to be recognised, more niche knowledge that was going to be directly impactful for a community. Because when you learn one narrative, you shut others off. You don't expand a narrative in a curriculum. You don't expand society itself. And just thirdly, really quickly on access to resourcing, we had massive cases from Bridget and John and tell you how underfunded and time poor teachers were, so it was never going to be equal. Because at the end of the day, I think it's far, far more important that we recognise the nuance of school and students rather than sort of trawl them in a net of marginally better standardised testing and centralised knowledge that restricts and limits the communities that its students rely on. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speaker for her speech, and I'll invite up the affirmative leader to conclude today's debate.
Now, when the negative team started talking about a static and whitewashed curriculum, I was a bit confused because that's exactly what you get when you allow schools to teach Othello to an English class for 10 years, when you don't put any incentive on them or the resources that they need to teach a curriculum that is engaging, that actually gets students interested in what they're learning, teaches a diverse range of perspectives, and actually prepares people equally for the future. They thought that there were a few contradictions in the case. We were pretty clear about what our model was right down the line, but let's just quickly go through that now. We told you that subjects are going to be teaching a number of standardized, specific content in units throughout the year, just like they do now. They might, a history class, for example, all history classes in New Zealand might do a unit on Stonewall, might do a unit on the First World War, might do a unit on the Maori Land War, something like that, determined by the ministry. Everyone does that. We had that right down the line. It was not enough for them to be confused about what we were saying. Note that this reduces the burden on teachers because they now don't have to develop the curriculums. I'll have more responses to this later in the case, but the pressure is now on the ministry. We think the ministry is an organisation far better equipped to handle developing curriculums than single teachers or a small team of teachers, especially in rural schools. Two clash points that came up throughout the debate. Firstly, on engagement and equality, how do we teach these curriculums? Secondly, on inclusivity, how is this represented in our material? Okay, firstly then on engagement and quality. Because we gave you 5 reasons that homogeneous information, homogeneous delivery of curriculums was really beneficial for students. We told you that the choice came in different subjects, and then we were actually supporting the students who wanted to choose subjects that weren't within the mainstream, that didn't necessarily have the support in smaller schools. These are things that we actually strengthen. We think that the single teachers often are quite out of touch. They don't have the resources. Even if they want to develop a diverse curriculum, it's far easier for them to continue teaching something that they've taught for 5 years. They're not going to be changing. We need the government to put the impetus to give them resources in order to change. what we heard in response here was that students aren't going to be engaged no matter what, that they're not going to be interested in what's being taught. But we actually told you we get more engagement when there's a wide range of topics coming from the teachers. When the government is saying, here's lots of information about how you can teach these specific things in a way that's engaging, when there's those network structures that actually help teachers teach things that are actually interesting. Because a teacher teaching about the Russian Revolution for an entire year is not what's going to get teachers, what students engaged, actually it's not what's going to get them engaged in the things that they're learning about. What we need is a wide diversity of topics. That's what we get under our side of the house. That was unresponded to down the line from them. On teachers then, quickly, we also said that it removes the burden on them for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because they don't have to develop the curriculums themselves anymore, and also because they have the transferable skills to actually move to a different topic area to teach it effectively. They're actually able to network with other teachers. We supported small subjects in this way, the way that they didn't do, that we thought that led to closures and worse outcomes for these students. What were the outcomes of this? Well, we got unique outcomes in decreasing the disparity between these rich and poor schools. Because their only response to this is, well, rich schools still have a lot of money. Sure they do, but now they're actually able to deliver the same curriculums as the rich schools in the poorer schools, right? Maybe the gap isn't entirely reduced, but we get unique advantages, important advantages when we're actually able to give everyone the same curriculum. It's not enough for them to say that they don't get the same curriculum. Secondly, on inclusivity, because we told you that we only get inclusivity when we have a ministry that has the that is young, trained voices, has access to iwi voices, minority communities, that is uniquely equipped and funders to create curriculums that's representative, that's diverse. It's really important that we win on this material when we're able to prove that we are able to get students more engaged in the future that they are part of. Very proud to confirm.
I'd like to thank all speakers for their speeches, and I invite you guys to cross the floor and shake hands.
If you're going to leave the room wide, that'd be great.